In the late 1800s, death was a constant companion in Victorian homes. Families lived with the reality that children might not survive to adulthood, and when tragedy struck, they found ways to preserve precious memories. One of the most touching yet haunting practices of this era was post-mortem photography. These weren't morbid curiosities, but treasured family keepsakes. Parents would dress their deceased children in their finest clothes, arrange them in peaceful poses, and hire photographers to capture one final portrait. For many grieving families, this photograph would be the only image they ever had of their lost child. The practice was so common that photographers advertised special rates for memorial portraits. They developed techniques to make the deceased appear as lifelike as possible, often propping them up with hidden stands or posing them as if they were simply sleeping. Professional photographers carried specialized equipment designed specifically for memorial work. Some even offered painted backgrounds and elaborate props to create more dignified settings for these final portraits. These photographs were displayed prominently in Victorian parlors, serving as both memorial and comfort to those left behind. Photography itself was still a relatively new technology in the 1890s. The process required careful preparation, precise chemical mixtures, and considerable skill to produce clear images. Most photographers operated from established studios in larger towns, but some traveled to rural areas to serve families who couldn't make the journey to town. In 1898, one such photograph was taken in rural Pennsylvania. It showed the Miller family gathered around their recently deceased young daughter. The image appeared perfectly ordinary for its time. 4 living family members stood solemnly beside the child, their faces bearing the weight of grief that was all too familiar in that era. The photographer had done his work well, creating a dignified final portrait that the family could cherish. The composition followed standard conventions for memorial photography, with the family arranged in a careful grouping that emphasized both their unity and their loss. For over a century, this photograph sat quietly in archives, just another piece of historical documentation. It passed through various collections, occasionally examined by researchers studying Victorian mourning customs or photographic techniques. Nothing about it seemed unusual or worthy of special attention. The image quality was good, the subjects were clearly defined, and the overall composition met the standards expected from professional portrait work of that era. But in 2019, when digital historian Dr. Evelyn Reed began her work to digitize a vast collection of 19th century photographs, she would discover something that would change everything we thought we knew about this seemingly standard memorial portrait. The horror wasn't in the deceased child at all. It was in the shadows, on the wall behind the family. Because when Dr. Reed counted those shadows, she found one that didn't belong to anyone in the picture. Dr. Evelyn Reed had spent 15 years methodically digitizing historical photographs. Her colleagues knew her as someone who noticed every detail, every crack in an old frame, every spot on a damaged negative. She approached each photograph with scientific precision, documenting not just the image but its condition, its provenance, and any unusual characteristics that might affect its historical value. Her workspace was equipped with the latest scanning technology, capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye. Reed's background in both history and digital imaging made her uniquely qualified for this type of work. She had a master's degree in American history and had taught herself advanced digital restoration techniques. Her previous projects had included preserving Civil War photographs and documenting Native American portraits from the late 1800s. On a cold Tuesday morning in November, Dr. Reed was working on a collection donated by a Pennsylvania Historical Society. The Miller family photograph seemed routine at first. She placed it on her high-resolution scanner and began the careful process of digital enhancement. As always, she made detailed notes about what she observed. 4 adults, 1 child, typical Victorian mourning dress, formal poses. The lighting appeared consistent with studio work from that period. But then she did something she always did with group portraits. She counted the figures and their shadows to ensure the digital enhancement would properly capture every person in the frame. This was part of her standard documentation process, helping her identify potential issues with lighting or composition that might need special attention during restoration. 4 living family members. 1 deceased child, 5 people total. But on the wall behind them, she counted 6 distinct shadows. Dr. Reed's first instinct was to blame the technology. Old photographs often contained artifacts that could confuse digital scanners. She cleaned the glass plate carefully and scanned again, adjusting the scanner settings to eliminate any possible technical glitches. The 6th shadow remained clear and unmistakable. She checked for double exposures, a common problem with 19th century photography, but careful examination of the negative showed no signs of multiple exposures. She examined the lighting in the room, looking for objects that might cast misleading shadows. Nothing explained what she was seeing. The shadow was too well defined to be a smudge or damage to the negative. It had a distinctly human shape, tall and thin, appearing to belong to someone standing just outside the frame. The shadow fell at an angle consistent with the other shadows in the photograph, suggesting it was created by the same light source. But there was no one else in the photograph to cast such a shadow. Her curiosity transformed into determination. She began researching the photograph's origins, tracing it back to a small town called Millbrook in rural Pennsylvania. The photographer's name was embossed in small letters at the bottom of the print, Silas Blackwood. Local records revealed that Silas Blackwood had operated a portrait studio in Millbrook from 1885 to 1902. Townspeople remembered him as a skilled photographer who could capture remarkable detail in his portraits. His technical abilities were widely respected, and families often traveled from neighboring towns to have their portraits taken at his studio. But they also described him as an eccentric man with unusual interests. Several accounts mentioned his fascination with spiritualism, a movement that had gained popularity after the Civil War, as families sought ways to communicate with their deceased loved ones. The spiritualist movement had found fertile ground in communities that had suffered heavy losses during the Civil War. Photography had become intertwined with spiritualism, as some claimed cameras could capture images of spirits that were invisible to the human eye. Dr. Reed discovered that Blackwood had corresponded with prominent spiritualists of his era. His letters, preserved in the local historical society, revealed a man obsessed with the idea that photography could capture more than just the physical world. He wrote extensively about his belief that cameras might be sensitive enough to record what he called ethereal presences, the spirits of the dead that he believed lingered near their living relatives. The Miller family's story proved even more tragic than typical for the era. Town records showed they had lost not 1 but 3 children over a span of 5 years. The first was a teenage boy named Thomas, who died of consumption in 1894. The second was a toddler named Mary, who succumbed to scarlet fever in 1896. The third was the young girl pictured in the 1898 photograph, named Sarah, who had died of diphtheria just days before the memorial session. Newspaper clippings from the time described the Miller family as devastated by their losses. Neighbors spoke of parents who rarely left their home, consumed by grief that had deepened with each successive tragedy. The father, William Miller, had been a prosperous farmer before his children's deaths, but those who knew him said he seemed to lose interest in his work after losing his son. The mother, Elizabeth, was described as a woman who had once been active in church and social activities, but had withdrawn from public life entirely. When their third child died, they had turned to Silas Blackwood not just for a memorial photograph, but because they had heard whispers about his unusual methods and his claims that he could sometimes capture more than what the eye could see. Dr. Reed found Blackwood's private journals in a trunk that had been donated to the Historical Society decades earlier. Most entries described standard photographic techniques and business matters. He recorded details about chemical formulations, equipment maintenance, and client appointments with the precision of a careful businessman. But scattered throughout were passages that revealed his growing obsession with what he termed ethereal photography. He wrote about experimenting with different chemical processes, extending exposure times, and modifying his studio to enhance what he believed was the camera's natural ability to see beyond the physical realm. One entry, dated just 3 days before the Miller family session, was particularly revealing. Blackwood wrote about his latest experiments with a new silver halide emulsion that he had developed. He claimed this mixture was more sensitive to light than any commercial product available. He also described installing an elaborate system of mirrors in his studio, positioned at angles that he believed would help capture impressions left by departed souls. Using advanced digital imaging software, Dr. Reed examined the anomalous sixth shadow in extraordinary detail. When she enhanced the contrast and adjusted the brightness, the shadow's shape became even more distinct. It clearly belonged to a person, but not to anyone visible in the photograph. The figure appeared to be taller than the living family members, with a thin build that suggested an adolescent or young adult. The shadow's position indicated someone standing slightly behind and to the left of the family group. This discovery sent chills through Dr. Reed's research. The Miller family's first deceased child had been Thomas, a teenage boy. The shadow's proportions matched what you might expect from someone of that age and build. Could Blackwood's unusual photographic process have somehow captured an impression of this earlier loss? Further research into Blackwood's methods revealed a man who had pushed the boundaries of 19th century photography. Former apprentices, interviewed by local historians in the 1950s, described a studio unlike any other. The walls were lined with polished silver mirrors positioned at precise angles. Blackwood used exposure times that were unusually long for portrait work, sometimes keeping subjects perfectly still for several minutes. He mixed his own chemicals using formulas he never shared with anyone else. One apprentice recalled that Blackwood would sometimes ask clients about their deceased relatives before a session. He claimed this helped him prepare the proper atmospheric conditions for the photograph. The apprentice found this odd, but assumed it was simply Blackwood's way of connecting with grieving families. Looking back, the apprentice realized that Blackwood had been gathering information he believed would help him capture spiritual presences during the photographic session. The studio itself had been modified extensively to support Blackwood's theories about ethereal photography. In addition to the mirror system, he had installed unusual lighting, arrangements that created multiple, overlapping illumination patterns. He used candles and oil lamps in addition to standard photographic lighting, believing that different types of light sources might reveal different aspects of spiritual activity. Dr. Reed's investigation reached its climax when she discovered a hidden section in one of Blackwood's journals. Written in a simple substitution code that took weeks to decipher, this section contained detailed notes about his most ambitious photographic experiments. The entry about the Miller family session was extensive and chilling in its methodical detail. Blackwood wrote that he had prepared his studio specifically for the Miller family, knowing their tragic history. He had positioned his mirrors to create what he called ethereal resonance zones, areas where he believed the boundary between the living and dead might be weakened by the intense grief of the surviving family members. His special silver halide emulsion required a much longer exposure time than normal, during which he instructed families to think intensely about their deceased loved ones. The journal entry for the Miller photograph revealed his true intent. He believed that the combination of the family's intense grief, his extended exposure time, and his mirror system would create the perfect conditions for capturing what he called shadow impressions, visual echoes of the deceased that might appear on the photographic plate. He had specifically asked the family to focus their thoughts on Thomas, their deceased son, during the lengthy exposure. According to his notes, the Miller session had been his most successful attempt at ethereal photography. He wrote with excitement about the extra shadow that appeared in the final image, convinced he had achieved his goal of photographing a spirit. To Blackwood, the sixth shadow was proof that his techniques could bridge the gap between life and death, offering grieving families a form of reunion with their lost loved ones. Dr. Reed realized she wasn't looking at evidence of the supernatural, but at a fascinating glimpse into Victorian belief systems and the lengths to which grief could drive human ingenuity. Silas Blackwood had used the cutting-edge technology of his era, combined with his understanding of optics and chemistry, to create what he believed was a scientifically valid method for photographing spirits. The extra shadow wasn't a ghost, but rather the result of an elaborate photographic technique designed by a man desperate to give comfort to grieving families. Blackwood's mirrors, his extended exposure times, and his special emulsion had combined to create optical effects that he interpreted as spiritual phenomena. Whether the shadow truly represented something beyond our understanding or was simply an artifact of his complex process may never be definitively known. What makes the Miller family photograph so compelling isn't the possibility of supernatural activity, but rather what it reveals about human nature. Here was a family destroyed by loss, seeking any possible connection to their deceased children. And here was a photographer who had devoted his career to developing techniques he believed could provide that connection. The photograph stands as a haunting reminder of how Victorian families coped with death and loss. In an era before modern medicine, when child mortality was tragically common, people found extraordinary ways to preserve memories and maintain connections with those they had lost. Blackwood's ethereal photography was just one example of how technology and belief combined to offer hope to the grieving. Dr. Reed's discovery transforms our understanding of this particular photograph and others like it. What appears to be a standard memorial portrait is actually a document of a forgotten chapter in photographic history, where science and spiritualism intersected in the hands of a grieving community. The Miller family photograph now serves a different purpose than Silas Blackwood originally intended. Instead of proving the existence of spirits, it provides insight into the human desire to transcend death through technology and belief. The sixth shadow remains a mystery, but perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some questions are more powerful when left unanswered. This story reminds us that historical artifacts often contain layers of meaning that only become visible through careful investigation and modern technology. What appeared to be a simple memorial photograph revealed itself to be something far more complex and fascinating. What do you think Silas Blackwood truly captured in his photograph? A ghost, a trick of the light, or simply the image of his own obsession? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please hit the like button and subscribe for more dives into history's forgotten corners. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.